NOI Education Services, and I'm very fortunate to be continuing our series on assessment for the new RTO standards in our Roundtable series with Angela from Vivacity and Maree from Compliance Assist. So guys, we did briefly touch on in our last episode 1.3, which was all about testing. Recommend that you guys go and watch that episode. It'll be linked here, somewhere like that. I'm interested to get into some of the language that they talk about in the principles of assessment, rules of evidence, because the actual principles themselves haven't really changed. We've still got the same terms. However, it's interesting to see the way that they've changed, or I guess elaborated on what they are, like on how they've described it. So for example, when we have things like fairness, taking into account the learner's need, including reasonable adjustment, and where appropriate, enabling reassessment if necessary. I think that some of those little changes there are quite interesting, particularly when we look at it across different environments. Like when we look at it from a financial perspective, if we look at reassessment as an example, in the CRICOS environment, that's often charged at a fee. Is there some wiggle room there? Like what happens when an RTO is not enabling assessment because of the financial needs of the learner? Does that meet in with the fairness and equity that we've got now very much built into these standards? I'd be interested to get your kind of initial thoughts on principles of assessment, rules of evidence, and some of the specific language that has been brought into those. Angela, if you want to kick us off.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at this standard, or this clause in particular, is foundational in fostering an inclusive learning environment. And I think it ties into some of the other standards that we have, some new ones that we've got, which is now we've got disability, we've got First Nations that are also in there, and then we've also got some changes to support services and things like that. I think that's where this is going to tie in, is with those other new clauses that we have. That's going to be the major change from my perspective, and much more focus on those rules of evidence and principle assessment, and how they do, how you have adjusted your training and assessment in back to what I said in the last episode about your learner cohort and who is defined within your training and assessment strategy. So I think it's more of how are we identifying our learners' needs and then adjusting that training and assessment to meet their needs. And I think those other clauses are going to come in that are around support services. So that's my perspective.
Absolutely. Maree?
Yeah, my thoughts on it, Lauren, are the fact that this, in the previous version of the standard itself was, simply conduct according to, these rules of evidence and principles of assessment. This standard now actually is very, and then, sorry, in the previous, it was then you go to the guide to see what those, a definition or examples of what those particular principles of assessment, rules of evidence, actually are, or examples of. This has now got the actual rules and principles of assessment in the standard itself. And for me, that is a fairly significant change. So it's actually specifying, I look at 1.4A3 just as an example, and it says, validity. So the principle of assessment, validity, is the assessments of skills and knowledge is integrated with practical application and would enable the learner to demonstrate these skills and knowledge in similar situations. Whoa, straight away, that one to me is a bit very prescriptive in terms of there is an expectation of, that principle of assessment is really about, integration of knowledge, integration of skills, and application in a variety of contexts, etc. So now the actual principles of assessment are not just a heading of fairness, flexibility, validity, because these words are actually now in the standards themselves. So that would be what, you know, you're looking at if you were coming along to audit, not simply, you know, the information that was user guide. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from both of you is that obviously, I mean, both of you have spent a lot of time digesting the new standards as a whole. And I think that, you know, this standard, what I'm hearing from both of you is that kind of with this standard, it's not so much the changes within the particular language of this standard. We think that principles of assessment, rules of evidence, they are what they are. They're integral to our industry. But taking that into account now in terms of the larger standards, in terms of equity and well-being, and a stronger focus on training and, you know, a stronger focus on like contextualization and really thinking about and considering learners, that's probably more where this particular standard, so, you know, your policy as such might not change, but a renewed focus on, for RTOs on, do my tools really meet the needs of my cohort? Do we have processes that allow for that to occur? And then when we then take that to the next point, how do RTOs, you know, if I'm an RTO and I'm looking at all of this and I know I've got to be compliant with all of this from 1/1/25, what are some of the pieces of evidence that I need to start collecting? What are some of the process changes that I need to be making in order to account for that? What's your advice to RTOs who are looking at this and kind of going, okay, but what does that practically mean for me in terms of my assessment tools and things like that?
One thing that I find very interesting within this, so if we look at 1.4b, assessors make individual assessment judgments that are justified based on the following rules of evidence. It's more of a focus on the assessor now, not just the RTO.
The assessment.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's going to be a lot more responsibility on the assessors when it comes to these standards now. And I think that's really going to tie in with the workforce development plan and having that in place as well, and the responsibility of trainers and assessors when it comes to workforce development. This is actually saying now the assessors are responsible for the assessment judgments, which should have always been that way, but it's actually clarified now within the clause.
And I think, Angela, that even goes to, you know, 1.4a, that assessment is conducted in a way, not that the assessment system itself, it's that it is actually conducted in a way that is consistent with these principles.
The more onus on the assessor.
On the actual process, on the practice of it, as opposed to the tools, the methods, etc. Yeah. And I think that by putting the words, rather than just saying is consistent with, you know, with the principles of assessment, of fairness, of flexibility, I think that the standard is trying to actually really spell out the interpretation of fairness, the interpretation of flexibility, the interpretation of validity, you know, and reliability, obviously, to go, well, you know, it's not a choose your own adventure as to what you think these principles mean. Here is what we mean by the principle of fairness, because otherwise, you know, because they've put those words into a legislative standard, as opposed to previously having it as the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence in the legislative standard, and then you have the what does, you know, how are they interpreted in a guide. Now it's actually saying, no, this is the interpretation of it. You know, don't come up with your own. Here's the one that we're giving you.
So I'm really interested in how ASPA will interpret this as well when they write the user guide.
Do you think that from, I mean, I guess one of the interesting components, just from an operational perspective on this, is how, I mean, there has been a separation over the years of compliance and trainers and what their duties are and what their responsibilities are do you think that in your interpretations of this, one of the focuses for this year for RTOs does need to be looking at having processes where trainers can be more integrated into the design and feedback process, and also potentially really an upskilling of trainers as well, to go back to, you know, helping trainers to really understand their units, to really understand, you know, what the principles of assessment are and how that looks, and what the rules of assessment, like what the rules of evidence are and how that looks. I mean, in my opinion, I still think, I mean, every year I do a series on the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. It's because every year it continues to be an area where, you know, trainers come to me and they go, you know, one side goes, I still really don't understand this. And then the other side goes, I'm really frustrated because I know I have a responsibility on these tools, but our processes are such that I can't have any say in. So, you know, how do you know, what advice do we give to RTOs and to trainers in those situations to kind of go, well, this is kind of going to be a way that you're going to have to negotiate that. And you've got the next, you know, 10 months to kind of really bring that in and make some changes to your organizational, you know, structure and, you know, culture as to how that's all going to work.
Yeah, well, I've been teaching every year. I deliver a workshop on assessment validation and explain the rules of evidence and principles of assessment. And it is an area where there is a lot of non-compliance. It has been historically. So it's not just trainers and assessors understanding, it's also the RTOs understanding how they work. And the way I explain it is we have our unit of competency, then we have our rules of evidence and principle assessment, and they all layer over each other. And we use the rules of evidence and principle assessment to identify whether we're delivering the unit of competency to meet those requirements. So it's really looking at the unit of competency, breaking down the performance criteria and saying, in our assessment tool, are we valid? Are we reliable? Are we meeting the requirements of the rules of evidence and principle assessment? And I think once people see it as it's an overlay, it's not separate, it's an overlay of the performance criteria and the assessment conditions within the unit, then they're able to get a better understanding. And that's how I explain it to trainers and assessors. And I think now, moving forward with the new, and you can start doing this now, but moving forward with the new clauses, trainers should be taking that into consideration while they're conducting assessment, training and assessment. And how are they applying that in their delivery of their training, as well as conducting their assessments, and start thinking about how do the rules of evidence and principle assessment overlay and interlay into that unit of competency. Maree?
Yeah, no, I cannot disagree. And I think it sort of takes a step back into in our previous session, we were talking about that testing. And that sort of whole concept of, you know, testing, you know, and I think that sort of talks to it as well. You've got to understand what the principles are. You've got to understand what the rules of evidence are. You've got to understand what the actual requirements of the training package are, in order that you can go, well, is this going to work? Is this going to make sure that, you know, the evidence I collect is going to be, you know, what I need it to be, or the you know, it's being done in such a way that, you know, it's fair and it's equitable and it's flexible and all the rest of it. And can I be flexible? And I think that, you know, that whole testing process is so critical to this process. And, you know, the number of times, to be honest, I've picked up an assessment at an RTO and thought, I haven't got the first clue what it is I'm supposed to be doing. You know, as a learner. So, you know, I like to put my learner's, you know, shoes on and go, well, I can't work out what am I supposed to be doing? Or how on earth am I going to do that? Or, and then I put my assessor's hat on and go, I can't figure it out either.
Conduct it.
Yeah. So how on earth can I conduct it? And then, you know, Lauren, the point that you were making is that business about, you know, we've tested these tools, because, you know, 1.3 is about testing the tools, and it specifically says tools. And then we come down to 1.4, where we're actually talking about conducting the assessment. And, again, this is one of the things that comes up repeatedly, the assessor who you go, well, hang on a minute, but this tool says this, but you've done something completely different. Oh, yeah, that didn't work. I couldn't get that to work, or, they couldn't understand, whatever. So making that consistency between them as well. And assessors understanding that you're going to be conducting this. Can you? Your learners, can you actually do this? Because if not, we need to step back to 1.3 again, and go, well, hey, this doesn't work. It doesn't achieve what I need it to achieve. But you're not authorized to just go ahead and just, you choose your own adventure and do it yourself. So yeah, I think that, again, this is an area that has always been problematic, and I'm not sure how much it's improving, to be honest.
Yes, it will be very interesting to see how we're going to be audited against this, and what will be different. It was interesting, Lauren and I at the last VELB conference actually spoke to some of the auditors, the ASPA auditors, and they didn't know how they were going to interpret it, because they had actually, the people that we spoke to said it's so ambiguous, all of the standards, they don't know how they're going to be auditing against them. Particularly, so a lot of the changes in the standards was to break it down for big and small RTOs. So it's ambiguous because of that, because it's going to be different for different size RTOs. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be more of an onus on the trainer and assessor to be taking into consideration what are the rules of evidence and principle assessment, not just on the RTO. I think it's the trainers really thinking about how am I applying the rules of evidence and principle assessment whilst I'm delivering my training. Is going to be, instead of just validation, we're validating and we're integrating, it should be in their day-to-day delivery of their training and assessment. How am I applying this?
And I think that's going to take us brilliantly into our next question. Guys, you'll be able to see that video out in just a couple of days. We hope that you enjoyed this one. Also, make sure that you check out our first video on Standard 1.3. Again, I am lucky enough to be here with Angela from Vivacity and Maree from Compliance Assist, and you can find all of their details, including being able to follow them on their socials, just below. Guys, we will be back in just a few minutes for you guys in 3 or 4 days. My name is Lauren Hollows from NOI Education Services.